I never intended to find myself at the center of a neighborhood war. All I had wanted, after retiring from the state's Department of Environmental Protection, was a quiet life, the kind where early sunrises shimmer across still waters, where loons call through the morning mist, and where lake water gently slaps against an old wooden dock. I'd earned that life, after 31 years spent enforcing conservation laws, inspecting water systems, and testifying in court against land developers who seemed to think regulations were optional. All I wanted was peace. So I bought 2 acres of shoreline and forest tucked in Alderwood County's northeastern corner, wrapped almost entirely by a small spring-fed private lake shaped like a silver horseshoe. That lake, my lake, wasn't especially large, but it was deep, legally protected, and fed by underground springs. I purchased it in 1999, along with the property, an aging boathouse, a dock, and enough land to build my modest single-story home, with wraparound windows and a screened-in porch that faced the water. I even kept the old name carved into the wooden archway over the dock's path. Davenport's Elbow locals told me it was named for a Civil War veteran who once fished there. I liked that, a quiet legend on a quiet lake. For more than 2 decades, life stayed good. Simple. Each spring, I cleared brush by hand, kept up the trails, and restocked the lake with native fish from licensed hatcheries. Occasionally, I hosted canoe clubs or taught local kids how to identify frog calls. No jet skis, no loud parties, just me and the land. Then came the survey markers. At first, I figured someone had just forgotten those bright orange flags, little plastic triangles, fluttering like strange flowers at the edge of my northern tree line. I pulled them out and tossed them in the garage. But the next week, there were more, this time attached to spray-painted stakes. Not long after, 2 men in hard hats appeared, walking the north ridge and peering through the trees at my lake like they already owned it. "Can I help you?" I called from my porch, coffee in hand, my voice even. One of them waved. "Just surveying for a new community project. HOAs, expanding into the old Hollis property. Won't impact you, sir." But I already knew it would. I'd heard about the Hollis Salem abandoned cattle farm that had gone derelict, then auctioned off to a development group now calling themselves Meadow Hills. They had big plans, a gated luxury community with shared lake access, a clubhouse, and nature trails. Problem was, the shared lake they wanted didn't actually exist. Not unless they thought they could push their way into mine. It started subtly, mailers from Meadow Hills HOA, welcoming nearby properties to join the community. I ignored them. Then came the emails. Then the visits. A young woman in a pale blue blazer appeared at my door one morning. "We believe collaboration is the future of modern living," she said. "You have an incredible resource here. We'd love to make the lake a centerpiece for the neighborhood." I smiled, but not warmly. "It's not yours to make central." Her smile thinned. "Surely you'd be open to a partnership." I pointed to the framed deed above my fireplace. "It's mine, fully private, protected under state conservation law." She adjusted her jacket. "Well, sometimes deeds can be outdated." But told me this wouldn't be the last time I'd see her. By late spring, I heard heavy machinery through the trees. Trucks rolled in daily, hauling lumber, concrete, fencing. From my dock, I could see the steel frame of a large pavilion rising just beyond their property line, a deck extending like an accusing finger over the lake. They didn't even try to hide it. There were picnic tables, a kayak launch, signs that read "Community Shoreline Access." Only the shoreline wasn't theirs. It was mine. The trees they were cutting for a better lake view. Mine. The soil they were moving. It was diverting runoff straight into my fish hatch channel. I called the county. I filed formal complaints. I submitted my title, my survey maps, GPS coordinates. But the clerk just shrugged. They filed permits for a recreational structure on their own parcel. "Unless you can prove it crosses into yours, not much we can do." "I can prove it," I said, handing over the survey I'd commissioned in 2003, signed and stamped by a state-certified surveyor. "Well," she said, not quite looking at me, "you'll probably need a lawyer." That night, I stood at the end of my dock staring at the half-built monstrosity marring the shoreline. I felt something I hadn't in years, a slow, cold burn in my gut. Not fear, no, I'd seen too much for that, but a steady, righteous fury. I hadn't spent my life protecting natural resources just to watch an overfunded HOA bulldoze my woods and dump weekend picnickers on my dock. They thought I was a retired, old man with too much time on his hands. They were about to find out how dangerous that could be. The next morning, I drove into town and parked outside the Alderwood County Recorder's office, a modest brick building sandwiched between the firehouse and the old diner where I used to grab coffee after fieldwork. I still knew the layout by heart. In less than 10 minutes, I'd pulled the most recent Meadow Hills filings, parcel records, easements, permits, everything. The clerk, I'm someone who probably remembered me from the early 2000s, raised an eyebrow when she saw the stack. I requested someone stir up your piece. "Huh." I gave a slow nod. "They're building on land that isn't theirs and they're pretty confident about it." Her fingers tapped rapidly across the keyboard. Looks like Meadow Hill zones. About 42 acres the old Hollis tract. No registered easements. None of it touches the water. I felt a small surge of vindication. And the building plans, she pulled them up. Community gathering facility with water access amenities. Huh. This dock drawing here. The one with the kayak launch that's crossing into parcel 1B. That's not their land, is it? No, I said. That's mine. Jaime looked up. Then they're building illegally. Exactly. I thanked her and left with a thick folder of records. Back home, I spread them across my dining table, my property survey, their site, plans, GIS aerials. The violation was obvious. Their deck and the path leading to it cut 30 feet across my boundary. Worse, they'd torn out shoreline vegetation protected under wetland preservation law. If I hadn't seen it myself, I might have thought it was just carelessness, but this was deliberate. That same afternoon, I called Meadow Hills HOA. I was transferred to Karen Hall, Director of Community Enrichment. Mr. Davenport? She greeted, her voice a little too cheerful. What can I do for you? You can start by stopping construction on my land. A pause, a cough. I'm afraid I don't understand. I laid it all out: parcel numbers, surveys, GPS data, lack of easements, wetlands violations, runoff damage, illegal signage. I could almost hear her squirm. Well, our legal team and developers assure us we're within our boundaries. You're wrong, I said. And if you keep pushing this, you'll be looking at a demolition order from the State Water Board. Karen's tone cooled. Mr. Davenport, if you continue making baseless accusations, we may be forced to involve legal counsel. I almost laughed. Please do. Later that evening, a glossy HOA newsletter appeared in my mailbox, addressed to residents of the Lakeside community. On the cover, a full-color rendering of their lake pavilion picnic areas, paddleboard rentals, a banner that read, "Come Summer, 205, your lake, your life." I couldn't decide whether to be offended or amused. Your lake. They'd gotten so used to bulldozing past resistance that they never stopped to ask if the lake was even public. The trucks came back the next week, pouring concrete pilings. I stood at the boundary line, watching the cement mixer churn. Like a stomach full of wrong, I crossed into view. A worker shouted, "Hey, you can't be on site." I pointed to the ribbon tied to the survey stake at my feet. "You're standing on my land." He hesitated, then muttered, "Talk to the board," and walked away. So I did. The next HOA board meeting was in their prefab sales center, plastered in promotional posters and hollow promises. I wore my old field jacket, the one with the faded state badge stitched to the sleeve knot to intimidate. But because people still respect a uniform, even an old one, 6 board members sat up front in matching polos. Karen Hall was at the center, flanked by a note-taker and a man with a permanent scowl. I waited for public comment, then stood. "My name is Walter Davenport. I own parcel 199B, bordering your development. For the past month, your contractors have cleared trees and poured concrete 30 feet into my property." Karen's practiced smile didn't waver. "Mr. Davenport, our internal review has already resolved this. Our legal team confirmed we're within our rights." "Incorrect," I said firmly. "I have surveys from both the county and the state, GIS, overlays, GPS data. I've also filed a formal complaint with the Water Resources Control Board. They're reviewing it now." The scowling man barked, "You're threatening us with the state." "No," I said, calm as a still lake. "I'm warning you. You're in violation of environmental law, property law, and you could be looking at fines over $50,000 if you don't tear that structure down." The room stiffened. Karen's smile faltered. "We'll have our lawyers reach out." "Do that," I said, turning to leave. "Just know the clock's already ticking." When I got home, I filed the formal complaint online, attaching every survey, every photo, every permit. I listed shoreline violations, property encroachment, and wetlands damage. Then I waited. 3 weeks passed. The pavilion kept growing, painted, furnished, landscaped with imported stones and solar lights. They even held a soft opening barbecue. Kids ran down the path I'd once cleared by hand. Then, one Monday morning, it finally happened. I was trimming vines in my garden when a convoy of SUVs rolled up the old Hollis Road. 3 bore stayed in 6. One carried a drone team. It had begun. They parked in a neat row just outside the Meadow Hills entrance. The lead agent, a woman in a navy windbreaker, crossed onto my driveway. "Mr. Davenport." I stood. "That's me, Dana Keller. State Water Resources Control Board." She offered a firm handshake. "We're here to verify your complaint of unauthorized shoreline development." Her team was already at work unspooling tape, marking GPS points, taking soil samples. It was methodical, silent, professional. I led Dana to the northern boundary where the pavilion now loomed, cedar siding, oversized glass, a deck hovering arrogantly over my lake. Thomas Reed, the angry board member, came storming down the trail. "Can't just barge in here," he snapped. "This is private HOA property." Dana turned to him. "Sir, under Section 162.4 of the State Water Protection Act, Your development is subject to review due to proximity to protected waters and disputed land boundaries. Please do not interfere. You don't even have a warrant. Dana held up her tablet, displaying the inspection order. We don't need one for administrative review on parcels with unresolved disputes. Thomas glared, fists clenched. When the drone buzzed overhead, he stormed off, muttering about lawyers. For the next hour, we walked the property. Dana noted, each violation authorized grading, illegal vegetation removal, construction within the riparian buffer, and the worst of all, the pavilion footprint sitting 32 feet into my land. This isn't a simple oversight, she said, jaw tight. This is deliberate. I know, I told her. They ignored every warning. They submitted false parcel lines. The county never verified. Her frown deepened. They will now, over the following week, the inspection widened. State wetlands. Specialists had arrived. A representative from the Department of Fish and Wildlife came with a water quality test kit. A soil erosion expert tracked runoff patterns that were carrying sediment into the fish spawning grounds I'd spent years protecting. Even the county had to get involved, launching a code enforcement review. But the HOA didn't back down. Instead, they doubled down, sending out a counter-narrative flyer to Meadow Hills residents that painted me as a bitter old man, selfishly guarding a natural resource that should be shared. Social media posts soon followed, accusing me of blocking community progress and spreading misinformation. I stayed silent. I didn't need to respond because just 2 weeks after the inspection, a formal violation notice was posted on the door of the Meadow Hills Pavilion. It was big, laminated, printed on the bright yellow cardstock the state always used for environmental enforcement. 7 violations were listed. 3 of them carried mandatory fines of up to $10,000 per day, backdated to the start of construction. The final line said plainly, structure must be removed within 30 days of this notice. No appeal granted due to confirmed encroachment. The next HOA board meeting had a very different energy. The sales center was packed with frustrated homeowners. This time, I wasn't the outsider. The anger in the room wasn't directed at MIT, was directed at the board. Families who had bought into the Meadow Hills dream now faced skyrocketing HOA dues to cover growing legal fees and mounting state penalties. I sat quietly in the back while Karen Holt tried to spin it. We believe the state is overreaching. We're preparing legal action to challenge the demolition order. A man called out from the crowd, "You built it on land that wasn't ours." A woman added, "You told us it was community property. Why didn't anyone check the boundary?" Thomas Reed stood up, clearly sweating. "We were told the land wrapped around to the lake. The maps weren't clear." That's when I stood, speaking softly but with weight. "They weren't unclear, they were wrong. And you were told several times before a single foundation was poured." The room went quiet. "I've lived here for 25 years. I've worked with the state. I was protecting this lake long before Meadow Hills existed. And I'll keep protecting it because what you did wasn't just foolish, it was arrogant." No one interrupted me, not even Karen. When I left, a few residents followed. An older couple quietly apologized. Another man asked me to help him understand what rights he actually had regarding his lot. For the first time since this all began, I felt the shift not just legally, but in the public's eyes. The cracks in the HOA had started to show, and the clock on their demolition order was now ticking. 26 days left. You'd think after receiving a formal state violation notice, most people, especially an organization built on bylaws and rules, would pause, reassess, maybe rethink their next step. Not the Meadow Hills HOA. Instead of admitting fault and starting the mandatory teardown, they doubled down again in the most outrageous way possible. They threw a ribbon-cutting ceremony. I heard about it through a glossy flyer left under my gate latch. It showed Karen Holt beaming in front of the pavilion. Oversized scissors in hand, a bright red ribbon stretched across the railings. Below, it, in bold, "Celebrate our vision. Meadow Hills Lake Pavilion grand opening. Saturday at noon. Family fun, refreshments, live music." I stared at the flyer, stunned. On the back, printed in small, fine print, "Pending resolution of regulatory matters." It was almost laughable. Legally, I could have stopped them. I had grounds to file an injunction to block public events on a condemned structure. But I did it, not because I didn't want to, but because I wanted the state to see this arrogance firsthand. There's a point where a paper violation turns into a public spectacle, and Meadow Hills had just crossed that line. Saturday arrived, and with it, the full display of their delusion. Cars packed the streets. HOA members in matching polos handed out brochures. A bluegrass trio played on a temporary stage by the pavilion. I watched from my property line. Children ran up and down the illegal path they'd carved through my trees, now draped with paper lanterns and flimsy temporary fencing. But I wasn't the only one watching. Halfway through the event, 2 unmarked vehicles pulled into the lot. Out stepped Dana Keller and another officer from the State Water Board. They didn't shut the event down, they watched, they took notes. They snapped photos from a distance. That evening, Dana called me. "They really threw a party," she said, dry amusement in her voice. "Told you they'd push it. We're escalating." Fines start accruing daily now. More importantly, we're recommending a formal referral to the Attorney General's office for willful noncompliance that includes criminal liability if they don't stop. That changed everything. By Monday, Meadow Hill's inboxes lit up. The state's official enforcement escalation letter hit both email and certified mailboxes. It listed fines now totaling $130,000 and warned of potential criminal charges if public use of the structure continued. The HOA scrambled. Residents demanded answers in the Facebook group. Screenshots of the violation notices flew around, followed by angry comments. I thought we had rights to that deck. Why are my dues covering these fines? Did they even verify the land before building? The HOA tried damage control with another flyer, this one much less glossy and much more desperate. It offered a vague apology and promised to work cooperatively toward a resolution. But it was too late. The narrative had already flipped. The community no longer saw me as the cranky old man standing in the way of their lake dreams. They saw the truth. The HOA had lied. Karen Holt asked to meet, sat at a picnic bench halfway between our homes. She came in a pressed dress shirt, carrying a leather binder and sparkling water. I wore my field jacket and brought a yellow legal pad. Walter, she began, like we were longtime friends. I want to start by saying we regret how things escalated. I said nothing. We think there's still room to collaborate. Maybe a joint maintenance agreement. Shared shoreline access in exchange for formal recognition of your deeded land. I raised an eyebrow. You're offering me access to my own lake. She blinked. I meant shared use. No, I said firmly. You don't get to use it. You don't get to build next to it. You don't even get to walk your dog near it. She swallowed. We're willing to pay a licensing fee. There's nothing you can offer me that's worth not watching you tear down what you built. For the first time, she looked genuinely uncertain. So, that's it. That's it. She slowly closed the binder. You know this isn't going to look good for us. It already doesn't. As she stood to leave, I added, you were warned. Karen, I sent letters. I spoke at meetings. I brought documents. You ignored every one of them. She paused, staring down at the gravel path. We thought you were bluffing. I nodded. Now you know. That night, floodlights lit up the construction site not for more building, but for remeasuring. HOA hired surveyors returned, desperately searching for some loophole to hang on to. They didn't find one. The boundary line was clear. The encroachment was undeniable. 2 days later, a knock came at my door. A man in his 50s, shoulders slumped, holding a folded map and clipboard. He introduced himself as Joseph Palmer, a Meadow Hills resident. Mr. Davenport, he said, hesitant, I heard you know a lot about property lines. I invited him in. Over coffee, he admitted his backyard seemed smaller than what he'd been promised. Turns out, the HOA had based their lot boundaries on planned plots, not actual surveys. I offered to walk the line with him. We measured it together. He was right. His lot was nearly 8 feet short. That moment marked the beginning of Meadow Hills unraveling. Word spread fast. Residents began demanding third-party surveys. The discrepancies surfaced quickly. Promised lot sizes didn't match the deed records. Some homes overlapped protected zones. The HOA's power didn't collapse because of MIT, collapsed because the foundation of trust was gone. They didn't just ignore my warnings. They ignored the law, the truth, and the basic wisdom of restraint. And now the consequences were stacking up one homeowner, one refund, one state letter at a time. After Joseph Palmer left, I sat alone at my kitchen table, a dim overhead light illuminating a growing pile of maps, documents, and surveys. What started as a fight for my shoreline had become something much larger, quiet unraveling of an empire built on paper promises and unchecked arrogance. I pulled out my old files, the environmental assessments I'd ordered back in 2001 when I bought the land. I found a scanned copy of the 1993 Regional Hydrology Report, the one that detailed the critical wetland buffer around the lake. Then I pulled the drone photos from the state inspection and laid them side by side with an overhead shot I'd taken. A year before the HOA broke ground, the change was striking. Lost tree cover, eroded shoreline, a visible silt plume drifting straight into the fish spawning area. That wasn't just a cosmetic issue, that was an ecological offense, one that, if properly documented, could put Meadow Hills in violation of both the Hodge State Surface Water Protection Code and the Endangered Habitats Act, especially since the lakes, frogs, and fish were considered regionally sensitive. Suddenly, this wasn't just about property lines, this was potentially a crime scene. I called someone I hadn't spoken to in over a decade, Marcus Hale, a former colleague from my DS days, now an environmental impact assessor working for a state contractor. We hadn't really kept in touch since retirement, but when he picked up and heard my voice, he chuckled. Walter, I figured you'd resurface eventually. What's lit the fire? An HOA built a deck on my lake. I told him, and they tore up protected wetland to do it. I've got the photos. He sobered instantly. You have baseline data. I do. Historical reports, satellite images, species inventory, the works. Want to see for yourself? By noon the next day, Marcus was on my dock, tablet in hand, his salt and pepper ponytail tied back like always. We walked the perimeter of the pavilion, the illegal launch ramp, the spots where they scraped away topsoil and replaced it with decorative stone. He crouched, scooped up murky water, sniffed. "That's construction runoff," he muttered. "And that's bulldoze cattail habitat. Jesus, Walter. Still think I'm overreacting?" He stood, jaw tight. "No, I think this is about to get serious." He filed his own independent report that week. I never asked him what it said. I already knew Marcus was nothing if not thorough, behind the scenes. I compiled a master binder, every HOA misstep, documented in painful detail, a timeline of violations, photos, surveys, side-by-side images, quotes from their own flyers, promising shared lake access, screenshots from their social media where they'd used drone shots of my lake as a selling point. I made 3 copies, kept one, mailed one to the state attorney general's office, and quietly dropped the third off at the local ABC affiliate. No dramatic letter, just a sticky note. If you want a real story about HOA, corruption, and environmental abuse, start here. WDI waited. Meanwhile, Meadow Hills kept trying to save face. Emergency meetings, APR firm, carefully crafted statements blaming everything on contractor miscommunication. But the panic was spreading. I knew not from rumors, but from the steady stream of knocks at my door. A mother of 3, worried her fence crossed public easement. A young couple who found their foundation poured 5 feet into the setback zone. A retired veteran whose lot had no legal access road, despite what his contract promised. "I don't know what to believe anymore," one woman whispered, clutching her property map, hands shaking. I did. Meadow Hills had lied to everyone. So, I helped. I printed maps, highlighted property lines, taught neighbors how to request public records. I became Alderwood County's unofficial land rights advisor. Soon, people started gathering in my yard on Saturday mornings, folding chairs under the oaks, coffee in hand, legal pads on their laps. We weren't angry protesters. We were just neighbors looking for the truth, and we weren't getting it. From the HOA, it was during one of those meetings that I got the call I hadn't expected. "Mr. Davenport, this is Julia Moran from Channel 8 News. We received your packet. Is this a good time to talk?" I stepped away from the group. "It is," she continued. "I'll be direct. This story has legs. Between the state violations, the wetland destruction, and the false property lines, this could go statewide. But they said they'd need me on camera." I hesitated. "I'm not chasing fame," I told them. "Not fame," she corrected. "Credibility." I agreed to the interview, but only under one condition: they would also speak with the affected residents. I was never the hero in this story. I was simply the first domino. The real impact hit those who had trusted a system built on deception. That following Thursday, the segment aired. The headline read, "Lakeless HOA faces backlash over illegal construction and land misuse." There I was, sitting on my dock, gesturing toward the now silent pavilion, with its padlocked doors and the bright yellow state seal fastened to its wall. The camera swept over drone shots, destroyed lines, eroded shoreline, and the packed Meadow Hills meeting where residents shouted the board down. The fallout came fast. The HOA's inboxes collapsed under the flood of complaints. Their legal firm quietly dropped them. Realtors began scrubbing lake access from property listings. Home values dipped. And somewhere, buried in the stack of state legal filings, my request for permanent conservation status for my shoreline rose to the top. Everything was in motion, no, not through outrage, not through noise, but through steady, quiet pressure. The envelope was heavier than I expected. Thick paper, a wax seal from the State Office of Land and Water Affairs, and my name pressed on the front in the kind of typeface you only see in government offices or royal decrees. I opened it carefully with my old DeField knife, sliding out the contents with slow, deliberate hands, almost like a ritual. Inside was the official notice the state of Alderwood had received, reviewed, and formally opened an investigation based on the complaint I'd submitted. The Meadow Hills Homeowners Association was now the subject of a multi-tiered review for property encroachment, ecological violations, and misrepresented development claims. 2 additional documents were attached to one granting temporary protected status to the wetland buffer around my lake, and the other, signed by the Deputy Attorney General, confirmed that the AG's office was opening a case file for the first time since the first survey flag appeared in my woods. I let out a long, unguarded breath. This was real now. No longer a quiet property dispute between a retired conservation officer and a smug HOA board. It was the full machinery of the state rumbling forward, slow, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. The news broke before I'd fully processed it. Channel 8 aired a follow-up. This time, they showed the entire drone sequence, the scorched tree lines, the abandoned pavilion deck furniture, the bold new signs installed by the state: "Do not enter. Structure under legal review. State protected area." Meadow Hills residents appeared in quick interviews. Some were angry, some were simply stunned. A young father, holding his toddler, asked, "I just want to know why we weren't told. They kept saying this was legal." I thought, trusted them. It's embarrassing. An older woman said, "We told our friends we had lake access. Now look at it." The board predictably refused to comment. Karen Holt issued a canned statement, blaming the situation on between developers, contractors, and surveyors. It was weak. People saw right through it. In the weeks that followed, my phone started ringing almost nightly. Neighbors who once ignored me even publicly dismissed me now reaching out for advice. I did what I could to help. I wasn't a lawyer, but I knew more about land law than many attorneys I'd met. I helped one couple file for boundary verification. I helped another family draft a demand letter to challenge an HOA landscaping fine issued based on incorrect property lines. It felt like the neighborhood was waking up. One Thursday, I got an email from a junior policy advisor at the State Environmental Integrity Commission. She asked for a meeting. "I've been assigned to review Mr. Hale's assessment report," she wrote. "And yours, Mr. Davenport. The AG's office forwarded your file to us for internal auditing." We met at the county planning building. Her name was Naomi Choya Sharbide, soft-spoken with a tenacity that reminded me of a young field agent I once trained. She opened the meeting with a single sentence, "Walter, I think this is bigger than you realize." She laid out what the state had found so far. The pavilion encroachment was just the surface. Several other Meadow Hill structures had also crossed into greenbelt buffer zones. The lake's entire northern edge thicket of regenerating trees had been illegally cleared, likely to improve resale views. Drainage from a poorly constructed retention pond near the clubhouse was leaking fertilizer-rich water into the lake, fueling algae blooms. This wasn't just carelessness, Naomi said. This was a deliberate push to create a resort-style look, completely ignoring ordinances and long-term damage. I felt a chill. "How much of that can you prove?" I asked. "Enough," she said, tapping her folder, "and we're still digging." That afternoon, I was called into a private meeting with two attorneys from the AG's office. They reviewed my submission, cross-checked resident statements, and asked if I'd be willing to testify if this led to litigation. "I've been testifying in court since the 80s. I said, "If it gets that far, I'll be ready." They nodded. It wasn't lost on me that what started as an HOA dispute was now inching toward potential criminal charges. A few days later, I walked the lake trail, something I hadn't done in weeks. The old path still wound through the woods, overgrown but peaceful. When I reached a spot across from the pavilion, I stopped. There it stood silent now. No music, no flyers, no future homeowners sipping wine, just quiet railings and a structure, waiting to be erased. I found a smooth rock and skipped it across the lake, like I used to when I first moved in. The ripples spread calm steady. What they built the lies. The greed that was a splash. But what I built a foundation of truth, documentation, and quiet patience was a wave. By mid-month, Meadow Hill's lawyers attempted a settlement. They sent a couriered letter offering me a confidential agreement, a community easement fee, a public apology, and a possible pavilion removal, pending future environmental assessments. I laughed when I read it. No apology could undo the scars they left on the land. No check could fix the erosion or bring back the frogs that had gone silent at night. This wasn't about compromise anymore. It was about justice and consequences. I sent back one line. The deadline for voluntary removal has passed. My patience has not. A week later, the state issued a final enforcement order. The structure was to be demolished. The land restored under direct state oversight. Fines would continue until completion. No further appeals would be accepted. That evening, I sat on my porch, wind brushing through the trees that still stood. In the distance, I heard the soft beep of construction trucks backing up. This time, they weren't building. They were preparing to dismantle it all. The first thing to come down was the deck railing. I watched from my screened porch as two workers, in hard hats, unscrewed each cedar slat, stacking them in quiet, neat piles like coffins for a failed idea. The demolition order landed with the full weight of law. There were no clever statements now. No ribbon cuttings, no cheerful flyers in soft colors. Just silence, sawdust, and the slow undoing of a fantasy built on arrogance. Meadow Hill's HOA didn't send out an announcement. No warning to residents. One morning, the truck simply arrived. A backhoe, a flatbed for hauling debris, a porta-potty parked near the trail, a foreman with an orange vest and a clipboard pacing the tape line with the weary energy of someone who'd rather be elsewhere. By the second day, the windows were gone. The door stood wide, framing an empty echo where deck furniture once sat. Someone had left a folding chair and an old cooler behind. They were taken too, as if they'd never mattered. All across the neighborhood. People were watching. I walked into town that afternoon for groceries. Across the parking lot, someone called out to me. It was Mrs. Rojos, a Meadow Hills homeowner I'd only met once before. "They're tearing it down. Mr. Davenport," she said, almost breathless. "You really did it." I didn't correct her. It wasn't just me. The state had enforced it. The residents had spoken. The truth had surfaced. I'd simply lit the first match. Inside the store, 3 people nodded at me. One man patted me on the shoulder. It was strange being seen like this, not as the reclusive man who lived by the lake but as something else. Now, a neighbor who fought back, a reminder that the rules matter, and so does holding your ground, but the spotlight isn't always kind. That evening, my phone rang. An unfamiliar number. "This is Greg Turner," the voice said. "From the HOA's legal counsel." I stayed silent. "I'm calling to inform you, our clients believe the state's enforcement was influenced by biased reporting and incomplete documentation. They're considering a civil countersuit." I leaned back in my chair, watching the lake through the window. "Greg, you're free to file whatever you like," I said, "but I'd suggest you read the state's findings first." They didn't act on just my complaint. They acted on photographic, topographical, and ecological evidence collected by multiple agencies. "If you want to challenge that in court, be my guest," he paused. "My clients believe you incited public hysteria." I chuckled. "No, I encouraged due process. The hysteria came from your clients thinking they were above the law." He hung up without another word. The next morning, Channel 8 was at my gate. No full crew, just Julia Moran, the reporter who first broke the story, and a young cameraman. She stood politely on the gravel, like someone visiting a gravesite. "Mr. Davenport, any comment on the demolition?" I considered, then nodded. "Just this," I said. "The land remembers what you do to it, and it doesn't care if you were just trying to raise property values." She blinked, then smiled faintly. "That's poetic. It's the truth." Later that week, I got a letter from the Alderwood County Council. No legal jargon, no formalities. Just a simple note. "Dear Mr. Davenport, the council thanks you for your dedication to preserving the ecological and legal integrity of our county's natural resources. Your efforts have not gone unnoticed. We've begun reviewing other lakeside developments based on the standards you helped reinforce. We would welcome your input if you're ever interested in serving in an advisory capacity on future conservation initiatives. Respectfully, Monica Bell, County Chair." I folded the letter and set it by my mug. For a long time, I didn't move. I didn't need a plaque or public recognition. I didn't even need thanks. But that letter felt like closure. Still, Meadow Hills wasn't finished unraveling. An anonymous source, likely a former employee, leaked internal HOA emails to the press. The board had known all along that the land belonged to me. They gambled on a legal loophole, thinking that once the structure was built, I'd be pressured into a settlement or forced to allow community access. Asterisk, they lost. Residents called for resignations. A special meeting was held at the elementary school gym to vote on the board's future. Karen Holt never showed. Neither did Thomas Reed. By night's end, the board was dissolved pending a new election. Dozens of families filed for refunds tied to pavilion-related assessments, at least for announced plans to sell and move. Real estate listings began quietly dropping the Meadow Hills name altogether, and through it all, I stayed silent. No victory speeches, no public gloating. I simply walked my land, repairing the trails where the trucks had once rolled, replanting saplings where the roots had been ripped out. It took 4 days to dismantle the pavilion completely. When the last board was carried away, I stood at the lakeshore, hands in my pockets, watching the bare foundation shimmer under the afternoon sun. All that remained was scarred earth, a few scattered nails, and the soft lap of water against untouched rock. That evening, a little boy I didn't know biked up to my gate. He paused, then pointed toward the lake. "My mom says that's yours," he said. "It's really pretty." I smiled. "Yes, it is." He nodded. "Can I draw it sometime for school?" "Anytime you want," I told him, because now finally it was just a lake again. Mine. The news became public 3 days later. Channel 8 carried the announcement during their evening broadcast. Julia Moran's voice, calm and deliberate, spoke over images of the once pristine pavilion, now roped off behind yellow state tape. The state of Alderwood had ordered the total demolition of the Meadow Hills Lake Pavilion, citing severe violations of both property lines and environmental regulations. The Homeowners Association in charge was given 30 days to tear the structure down or face escalating legal and financial consequences. Asterisk. The camera lingered on the silent, still building under a sky the color of steel. Then it cut to Naomi Choi, the state's environmental policy analyst, standing lakeside during a press briefing. "This isn't just about private property," she said into the microphone. "This is about protecting ecological integrity. It's about the law. It's about what happens when ambition convinces people they can outrun their duty to truth." It was everything I'd been trying to say, but now, it was coming from someone whose voice carried weight. That night, the HOA board met behind closed doors. No public statement, no apology. But by the next morning, the trucks had arrived, not contractors in crisp polos, but certified state deconstruction crews. These were people in safety vests, with hardened faces and checklists sanctioned by the state. Their purpose wasn't to build dreams, but to take them apart. That morning, residents gathered quietly along the trail, murmuring to one another. Some cradled coffee cups. A few took photos. I stood farther back, arms folded, watching. As the first beams came down, someone behind me muttered, "They really thought they could just take it." Another voice replied, "They thought he wouldn't fight." A woman turned toward me, a neighbor I didn't know well. She gave me a faint nod, her eyes misty. "Thank you," she said softly. Just that. I didn't respond. I simply turned and walked back to my land, crossed the tree line, and began walking the stretch where their construction team had once laid illegal gravel over my roots. I knelt and placed my hand on the soil. It was still bruised, but it was healing. Over the next several days I documented the demolition, not out of spite, but because I felt I had a responsibility to. I took photos, tracked the progress, and built a new binder, a mirror of the first one, this time showing not destruction, but restoration. For some reason, it mattered to me too. Witnessed the dismantling with the same precision I'd used to track the harm. Midway through the process, I received a letter from the Department of Conservation. My petition to classify the shoreline around my lake as a privately managed conservation zone had been officially approved. The designation came with state protections, maintenance funding, and formal recognition of the land's ecological importance. It also meant that no future development would ever be allowed within 100 feet of the shoreline. Permanent peace. I pinned the certificate next to my framed property deed. But as the pavilion came down, something else began to rise up. Slow panic. Within Meadow Hills, the HOA board had all but vanished. Ghosts now barely visible, barely heard. Rumors of lawsuits simmered beneath the surface. Real estate agents canceled showings. Contractors refused new jobs tied to HOA money. One homeowner whispered to me that her dues had quietly doubled to cover legal contingencies. Another said she'd stopped paying altogether, and no one had bothered to follow up. The community wasn't unraveling in anger, it was fraying quietly. House by house, as the truth settled in, the realization had come. They'd all been pawns in a much larger lie. Later that week, I heard another knock at my door. This time, it was a young man in a maintenance uniform, clipboard in hand, his eyes uncertain. "Mr. Davenport?" he asked. "I've been hired to assist with shoreline cleanup. They said you might have some instructions." I invited him in, poured him a glass of water, and opened the binder where I'd kept photos of the undisturbed shoreline, how it had looked before the pavilion was ever built. "You're going to help me make it look like this again," I told him. He studied the images, his eyes widening. "This was beautiful." "It still is," I said. "We just have to listen to it again." Together, we started replanting. Not ornamental shrubs or foreign grasses, but native sedges, low ferns, and wildflowers that once flourished freely along the water's edge. I showed him how to clear invasive species, how to layer mulch to welcome the frogs back, and how to read the small signs of erosion. He listened. He learned. And in teaching him, I rediscovered something I hadn't expected to feel again: hope. The last piece of the pavilion was hauled away on a rainy Friday. Just before sunset, I walked down to the spot where it had once stood. The platform was gone. The beams were gone. Even the gravel path had been dug out and replaced with loose soil and straw to prevent runoff. I stood alone in the clearing, rain brushing my shoulders, and finally released a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The fight was over, but they didn't leave quietly. The final stages of demolition weren't even finished when the backlash started, not from the state, not from the county, but from the Meadow Hills HOA board members themselves. Disgraced and stripped of their influence, they launched their last offensive not with lawyers or bulldozers, but with something more insidious: a carefully crafted campaign to rewrite the story. It began with a slick website, meadowhillsfacts.org, complete with polished images of the pavilion in its prime, glowing testimonials from selected residents, and a timeline so twisted it nearly seemed plausible. They recast themselves as visionaries, brought down by bureaucratic meddling and retired obstructionists. Their version claimed the pavilion was a generous gift to the community destroyed because of a bitter neighbor with too much time and not enough goodwill. They never used my name, of course, but the subtext was sharp. Photos of the lake, taken from my dock without permission, appeared with captions like, "This shoreline was once open to all, now closed by bureaucracy." Then came the opinion pieces. Letters, signed by concerned Meadow Hills families, flooded local newspapers, grieving the loss of shared space, questioning the state's enforcement, even accusing environmental regulators of overreach. One letter called it a cautionary tale about what happens when a single landowner holds an entire community hostage. I read that one twice. The irony stung, but the smear campaign didn't surprise me. People with power rarely surrender it without tossing mud on their way out. But the real gut punch came when I received a certified letter not from a law firm, but from the newly patched together Meadow Hills HOA board. A group of interim members rushed into place after the previous board resigned in disgrace. The letter expressed concern over the damage done to the community's reputation and asked if I would be open to a restorative dialogue to begin healing divisions. I set the letter aside, not with anger, but because I knew the difference between true reconciliation and a carefully staged PR move. This wasn't an olive branch. It was a press release waiting to happen. Not everyone bought into their version. Though. One morning, while watering the young ferns we'd replanted along the shoreline, a man I didn't recognize approached me on the trail. Mid-30s, backpack slung over his shoulder, camera in hand. "Mr. Davenport," he asked. I nodded. "Ben Riker, Lakeside Journal. I'm working on a long-form story about land use and community conflict. I've spoken to state officials, Meadow Hills residency van, former board members, but I'd like to hear from you directly." I hesitated. I wasn't physically tired, but a deep bone-level exhaustion had settled in from being the only one trying to hold the truth steady, while others bent it to suit whatever story helped them sleep. But there was something in Ben's voice, quiet, thoughtful, patient, that nudged me. We sat on my porch for nearly 2 hours. He never interrupted. He never paraphrased. He just listened. I told him everything from the first survey flags to the final truck carrying away the pavilion's last beams. I showed him the documents, the photos, the letters from the state. When I finished, he asked me just one question. "What would you say to someone in your position 5 years from now?" I looked out over the lake. I'd tell them to write everything down, document everything, and remember the law moves slow, but when it moves like bedrock. His article ran 2 weeks later, titled "The Quiet Man and the Crumbling HOA, How a Lake Fought Back." It was damning. He revealed leaked internal emails. He quoted state regulators who confirmed the environmental violations were among the most egregious they'd encountered in years. He spoke to residents who now admitted they'd been misled all along. But more than that, he told the story of a man, me not as some cranky recluse, but as someone who simply refused to be erased. And that, I think, was the final blow. Within days, the Meadowhillsfax Oring website vanished. No explanation. Social media posts disappeared. The remaining board members fell silent. Even the interim president, who'd tried so hard to appear neutral, quietly stepped down. The HOA still existed on paper. The dues remained, the bylaws still stood, but whatever heart or illusion of authority it once had was gone. What rose in its place was smaller, slower, humble. Neighbors began to reach out, not to argue, but to help. One woman brought a basket of native wildflower seeds, asking if she could scatter them near the trail. A teenage boy offered to help clear storm debris. A couple from several streets over brought me fresh eggs and asked if I'd help them set up a rainwater collection barrel like the one I'd shown on TV. I said yes to all of it, because healing is stronger than outrage, and healing is slow, like soil rebuilding itself after fire. That summer, the frogs returned to the lake. I heard them first, soft, hesitant croaks in the western reeds, then more. By August, their nightly chorus had returned, layered and complex, just as I'd remembered. From years ago, one evening, long after sunset, I sat on the dock with my feet dangling over the water. The moonlight shimmered across the ripples. A single lantern glowed on a neighbor's porch. For a moment, everything was still. The lake had been taken from me. Then, it had been fought for. Now at last it had been given back. Fall arrived slowly. In Alderwood County, not in loud bursts of gold and red, but in quiet signals, the steady thinning of leaves, the shifting bird calls, the mist that lingered longer over the lake each morning. Nearly a year had passed since I first saw those fluorescent survey flags in my woods, since peace cracked open and everything changed. But change, I'd come to understand, isn't always destruction. Sometimes, it's a clearing. The pavilion was gone. The HOA had fallen and reshaped into something quieter, more accountable, and I had settled into a rhythm I hadn't known in years. Mornings were spent walking the lake's perimeter, checking the health of the wetland plants we'd restored. The sedges had taken root, the cattails had returned. The frogs called to one another across the shallows, their rhythms rising and falling, like songs ancient and stitched into the water. People still came, sometimes in twos, in threes. They trailed quietly, with a kind of reverence. They never crossed the boundary lines. They knew better now. Some brought notebooks, others took photos. They were gentle, they were careful, and that was enough for me. In October, I was invited to speak at the county's Land and Resource Forum, a twice-yearly event, usually filled with policy analysts and soil scientists. I declined twice. But then Naomi Choi called me personally. "Walter," she said kindly, "you don't need to give a speech. Just tell your story. People need to hear how these things begin and how they can end." So I did. I stood at a wooden podium in a small auditorium, folding chairs lined up, planners holding clipboards. I wore my old field jacket, the same one I'd worn when I first challenged the HOA. I brought no slides, no charts. I just spoke. I never wanted to fight, I began. I only wanted to be left in peace. I told them about the survey flags, the bulldozers, the stone path cut through the cattail marsh. I described the smell of torn soil, the quiet panic of watching something you love suffocated by ambition. And then I told them about the frogs coming back, about the kids planting wildflowers, about how things can break and still be healed. When I finished, the room was quiet. Then came applause, not loud, not dramatic, just honest. Afterward, a young woman approached me, her notebook filled with scribbles. She was a land use consultant from another county. "Would you ever consider writing about this?" she asked. "Not for regulators, for people, for homeowners, for communities trying to protect what they have." I considered it. Maybe. In the months that followed, I began keeping more detailed journals, not just legal records and maps, but feelings, images, moments, the way the light touched the lake in October, the exact day the first frog laid eggs, again. The questions children asked on our shoreline walks: do dragonflies sleep? Can trees talk to each other? Why are mushrooms always hiding? That last question lingered. Maybe mushrooms hide because they grow in silence and shadow until the time is right, and when they appear, they remind us that beauty doesn't always arrive loudly. By winter, I'd started a small community group. Nothing formal, just monthly gatherings in my barn. Hot cider, chairs in a circle, conversations about stewardship. We called it the Shoreline Circle. People came from other neighborhoods, nearby farms, even from the city. Some had fought their own land battles. Others simply wanted to listen. And through it all, the lake remained not untouched, but respected. One cold evening, as I walked back from the dock, I found a familiar figure waiting on my porch. Marcus, Hale, my old friend from the Department of Environmental Protection, hands in his coat pockets. "I heard about your forum speech," he said with a grin. "You're practically a folk hero now." I snorted heartily. "I'm just the guy who said no and meant it." We sat inside, shared a whiskey, flipped through the binder one last time. Photos of the pavilion, letters, news clippings, frozen pieces of another life. "You ever think you'd be doing this after retirement?" he asked. "Not in a million years." He raised his glass. Two quiet men who don't stay quiet. I raised mine. Land that remembers. Later, after he left, I returned to the porch. The lake shimmered faintly beneath the pale moon, still, waiting. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like someone who had defended something. I felt like someone who had been invited to live beside it again, not because I fought, but because I stayed. And in staying, I reminded others that peace isn't passive, it's earned, it's tended, it's protected, just like a lake.